of the millions of Americans who believes the Constitution is protecting our freedoms. Well, if you've ever been seriously ill or relied on certain foods like raw milk or organic non-GMO foods for your recovery, you've quickly found out that the government doesn't have your back, and in fact is working overtime to outlaw these very foods. That's why the guest heretic today is Peter Kennedy, an attorney for the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. He has dedicated his work to protecting both family farms and consumers who want to eat the life-affirming foods that they provide. Listen in as Peter describes the outrageous cases in which he's had to defend small farmers, how the government protects corporate food operations from responsibility, and what the FDA thinks about your right to consume healthy food. Coming up next.
Meet Gina. Gina wanted to lose weight, so she spent 2 years fasting, detoxing, and dabbling with vegan diets while practicing a shit ton of yoga to lose 25 pounds, but it took so long that nobody noticed. Then, Gina started Frenching her food by eating fatty cheeses, butter, sausages, and red meat, and lost 15 more pounds in only 2 months. Everybody noticed this time. Frenching your food unlocks the riddle of weight loss that skinny French chicks use to slim down, look young, and live longer despite doing everything wrong. Be like Gina. Start Frenching your food today by visiting nutritionheretic.com/Frenching.
Fat is bad for you.
I just pop a pill and I'm fine.
Meat is murder.
It's time for bad food punishment. It's time for real nourishment. It's time for the Nutrition Heretic.
The following program is provided as information only and may not be construed as medical or health advice. It is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any disease. No action or inaction should be taken solely on the basis of the information provided here. Please consult with a licensed healthcare professional or doctor on any matter relating to your health and well-being.
And we're back. I don't know if you recognize this voice, but the last time you heard me, I wasn't so good sounding. I was really bad, you could say. Okay, I can hear Adrian laughing. What's so funny?
It's you. You're funny.
It's me. So it seems like, among other things, I got resurrected on this show, so we better get rolling.
I'm sorry for not including you on the Nutrition Heretic podcast previously for the last couple of months because I have been running around like a chicken without a head, just trying to get through the holidays, trying to just keep my head afloat. And then my husband was down from San Francisco for like 6 weeks, so that just kept me distracted and trying to keep up with life. But my pet peeves, don't you?
Oh, yeah.
And you know that I have this pet peeve that in the United States, I can buy a gun legally, but I cannot buy milk without going to jail. And when I say milk, I mean real milk, not the swill from the pus and blood infected stuff that's on the regular supermarket shelves. I'm talking about real milk from a real farm. This is an increasing problem in this country, and a lot of people are pretty much fed up with it. As you remember, we had Charlotte Smith on the show, and she's with the Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund. She recommended that we speak with our today's guest heretic, who is Peter Kennedy. He's also a Farm to Consumer Legal Defense Fund, and he is an attorney for them. Peter, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, Adrian. Hi, Nicola.
Thank you so much for being on the show because, as I've stated before, when people get on this track, they want to improve their health. Usually the first thing they do is they cut out meat and dairy because they think that those are the devil. But then, after a couple of years, they're like, well, my body needs it. I need to stop cleansing and I need to start building, and they're looking for options. And one of those things, one of the entry foods, I like to call it, is dairy. Many farmers, and it's not just limited to dairy, but that is the big area, which is raw milk, where farmers are continually being raided and their families held at gunpoint, their herds being shot, and they're basically driven out of business by the U.S. government. Talk to us
That
about
sounds
that.
terrible.
I mean, what do you think, Peter? What do you think the founding fathers of this country would have done differently with regards to the Constitution or whatever bill they would have had to pass if they knew that food would be under attack 200 years
Well, that's
later?
a good point you bring up, Adrian, because I've heard a number of people say the reason the founding fathers didn't bring anything up about a right to the food of your choice was that it was just assumed at that time. Back then, as far as I know, there were some aspects of food production and sales that were regulated, but for just going out to the local farm, purchasing raw milk, best I can tell, that kind of activity was hardly regulated at all. But just as the years have gone on, I mean, there was a time in this country 100 years ago where you had these swill dairies. A number of people were getting sick from raw milk that was produced in very unsanitary conditions. But I think, since then, there's been the advent of refrigeration, just stainless steel bulk tanks, that kind of thing, where that's long in the past. And just a lot of these public health people are just carry on like it isn't in the past. But it's milk's an unusual food because it's the only food I know of that's actually banned in interstate commerce. FDA issued a regulation banning it 30 years ago. So what that does is it affects the state laws. In most foods, the laws are pretty uniform. If, like in meat, poultry, the state governments have to, at a minimum, adhere to certain federal standards that are spelled out in the Federal Meat Inspection Act, the Federal Poultry Products Act. But with milk, it's basically up to the states. So you have some states where maybe you can sell up to 100 gallons a month. You have some states where goat milk is legal, but not cow milk. You have a couple of states where you can only purchase milk with a note from a doctor. You have states where it's legal in retail stores, states where it's just legal on the farm, states where the sale is illegal, but it could be legal through what's known as a herd share arrangement, where someone purchases an ownership interest in a dairy animal or herd of dairy animals, and as a result of that interest, can get milk. And then you have other states where it's only legal as pet milk. What's happened is, in spite of this ban, I think there's legal access through either statute, regulation, or court decision, or just departmental policy. And, they made a decision not to enforce against it, where any law prohibiting raw milk sales, where I'd say there's legal access in over 40 states right now. So eventually this federal ban isn't going to mean all that much if it's legal in every state anyway. And we worked with Ron Paul's office, I get this something like 9 years ago, on introducing a bill that would get rid of the interstate ban. I mean, he's no longer in Congress now, but he's got a great successor on this issue, Thomas Massie out of Kentucky, who was introduced.
Okay.
Yeah, two different bills. One that he introduced in last session. From what I understand, he's going to reintroduce in this section. One would completely get rid of the interstate ban. One would at least modify it, where you could ship it from one state where it was legal to another state where it was legal. But don't know when it's going to happen, but I think eventually the ban will be no more.
Wow. And when you say so that's just the ban for interstate.
Yeah, interstate.
What do you, right. What about, I mean, I live in Hawaii. I can't get to the next state.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it's illegal.
Well, I know there's been a raw milk bill introduced in Hawaii the last few sessions, and I think there's going to be another one introduced this session. So, I mean, it's available. There's some of these herd share programs out there. I don't know if there are a lot, but I mean, based on what I hear from Hawaii, something has a chance of passing, I think, the next couple of sessions. And as you know, I mean, why not? Because there's hardly any dairy industry out there, right? As far as I can tell, there's only one grade A dairy in the whole state. So
that would be the Meadow Gold.
right.
I believe that's, and yeah, their dairy is quite scary. I mean, besides the fact that it's ultra pasteurized, homogenized, they put so many fillers in it.
Right.
I can't, I don't even know how they call it milk.
Well, I mean, just ultra pasteurized milk is like sludge, and then just a lot of this pasteurized milk is like watered down chalk. So
don't even get me started on that stuff. When I found out how it was made, I mean, I already wasn't drinking it, but when I found out how it was made, I've been telling all my friends who are like, "Oh, I can only drink the skim stuff," and I'm like, "You know what's in there?" So
well, yeah,
but yeah, and you would think.
Yeah, that's actually something the dairy industry has been very good at, is encouraging the consumption of skim milk, low-fat milk, where the nutrients are in the fat, but in the meantime, they get to take that cream, make another product out of it, and get paid twice instead of once.
Right, so. Exactly. And one thing that I always tell people, because they're on these clean diets, and so they want the low-fat and the skim milk. And then I tell them that it's, the expired milk, the infected milk, and all these other undesirable forms of milk that have been desiccated and then added to it. Considering that the leg the FDA is trying to stand on is one of safety.
Yeah.
It's so contradictory. Not only because of the thing I said about having a gun, but also because they're putting the rejects in that skim milk.
Yeah, when you look at some of the things FDA has legalized, like aspartame, high fructose corn syrup, just MSG, it just doesn't make any sense at all. It's just driven by industry.
Right,
yeah.
Right, yeah.
Our organization, I think there are really two food systems. There's the industrial food system and the local food system. And really, more than any other food, raw milk is the gateway to both systems. If you go to a supermarket, you go initially to get the perishable items, of which milk is one. When you're in the supermarket, you'll buy other foods, other products there, and just the same principle we found holds true more often than not with a farm. They'll go there to get raw milk, and when they're there, they might buy meat, poultry, eggs, produce, but raw milk, a good bit of the time, is what gets the customer on the farm in the first place. So
right, exactly.
These raw milk bans are just anti-competitive regulations disguised as health regulations. I mean, people can get sick drinking raw milk. It's happened. They get sick on any food if it's improperly produced or improperly handled.
Right. And I think so many of our more recent food scares, first of all, they're covering entire regions of the country, California, the Northeast, what have you. And many of those came through vegetable products. The vast majority came from vegetable products. Occasionally you hear like a ground beef one, or maybe a chicken. There was the chicken thing in California with Foster Farms. But for the most part, I mean, they've tried to incriminate raw milk several times, but many of these so-called outbreaks didn't even consist of everyone consuming raw milk.
Well, it's interesting because we've had a number of calls over the years on foodborne illnesses blame raw milk. But what we'll get a lot is just where there's one illness, and that's not officially a foodborne illness, and they're still trying to pin it on raw milk. And number one, they wouldn't do that on any other food, I don't think.
Exactly.
And then the second thing is, when you're sick and you have to fill out, I guess, these intake sheets if you're going to a doctor or something like that, and they ask you about all these different products you've consumed. And from what we've seen, what happens again and again, as soon as the sick individual puts down on the intake sheet that he or she's consumed raw milk, that's the investigation ends right there. I mean, they don't
Yeah.
look at any other possibilities. They just zero in on that. And on these cases where there are 1, 2 illnesses, things like that, and they blame raw milk, just from what we've seen, far more often than not, raw milk had nothing to do with the illness.
Right, right. And I think there are a number of consumers who kind of straddle the line. So they want to do more back to the farm. They want to source their food locally, but there's that nagging voice. It might be the mother-in-law or whomever saying, "Oh, it's that milk," So those people might also be like, "Well, I don't know. I had some raw milk," because otherwise I would just say milk, right?
Yeah.
Well, if you, I would be filling out the form. Yeah, I had some milk. I had, green peas, whatever.
Well, yeah, a lot of it initially is just breaking down the walls in your mind. I mean, because you just hear so much of this anti-raw milk propaganda from the public health departments. But what we've seen is you just get a lot of people who have health issues, and they raw milk is part of their protocol to recovery. So they're desperate enough where they kind of put all the rhetoric against it aside and try it. Not in every case, but in many cases, it does help them. One example I can give you is just lactose intolerance is a big problem in this country. And we commissioned this polling firm to, just survey number of people, find out how many people they estimated were lactose intolerant. And it came to something like 29 million. And just aside from that, we have this retired MD who's our raw milk expert, and he did a poll of his own. He commissioned, surveyed about, I think it was around 1,500 raw milk drinkers in the Midwest. And one of the questions on his survey was, have you ever been diagnosed with a healthcare professional, as having lactose intolerance? There are a couple hundred, I think, or it was well over 100 anyway, that said they had. And out of that number, I think it was something like 82% of them said they could drink raw milk without a problem.
Right.
Conventional milk is just a highly problematic food, highly allergenic. And it's showing in the bottom line. They're just losing market share every year. I think about 50 years ago or so, there were something like 600,000 dairies in the country. Today, it's right around 50. And that figure I saw was a few years ago, so it might be lower than that.
So about how many family farms, not just raw milk farms, but family farms in general, are going out of business every year?
Well, I can give you an example. The state that has more raw milk dairies is Wisconsin. And, raw milk is Wisconsin has raw milk dairies by far than any other state, I think. And raw milk is legal there, but in a very limited way. Yeah, the farmers really can't make a living selling it for the most part. And I think it was a little over 20 years ago, they had close to 30,000 dairy farms. And now, from what I understand, they're under 10,000. So it's just the conventional milk system is just complex enough so these farmers can't quite figure out how they're getting.
Right.
But if you're a small farm, and you're still in it, you need to get out of it. And there are 3 ways I see that they can get out of it. Number one, they can get their own bottling and pasteurization equipment, but that's a big capital investment. Second, they could just start making value-added products, yogurt, butter, things like that. Again, that's a big investment. The third way, which is not nearly as big an investment, is just be able to sell raw milk direct to the consumer instead of selling it to the co-op. What the co-op might pay you $1.50 for if you're not organic, you might get $6 for selling direct to the consumer. In some areas of the country, you could probably get a good bit more.
Right. What I'm wondering is if you could describe for us what some of the raids on these farms look like.
Okay. Well,
what's like, people think like, oh, well, they should be stopped, whatever. But what kind of gear,
well,
which departments are going into these farms, first of all? and have jurisdiction in these different states. And what are they doing? And again, I'm comparing this to cocaine possession or something like that. How does this look when they go in?
I mean, what often happens is it just starts as a routine inspection. The inspector will go in, say, of a conventional dairy. I mean, we have a member in Michigan where these herd share agreements are legal, just with a caveat being that only fluid raw milk can be distributed to someone who has an ownership interest or ownership rights in the cows on the farm. Butter, cream, none of that can be distributed. And what happened was, just legally, that distinction, I think, is made to protect the dairy industry because the value-added products are really where the money are. But at the same time, if you say that this is the shareholders or leaseholders' milk, well, why can't they retain someone to have that milk made into another dairy product? Because what you're saying is it's their property when it's milk, but all of a sudden, when it becomes butter, that's the state's property, or just it's an illegal transaction, which doesn't make any sense from a property rights standpoint. But anyway, what happened was this guy in Michigan, every time he gets inspected as a grade A dairy twice a year, and pretty close to every time he goes, the inspector comes up in there. They go in this one room which is just reserved mainly for these people that have leased cows that are actually separate from his grade A herd, and just get those the milk from those cows, which they have the ownership rights in, made into another product. And I think this has happened like 3 or 4 times now. They will go into this room that's only it's leased out to these leaseholders of the cows. It's not part of the grade A operation. They'll take product every time. And what happened after a while was the Department of Agriculture went to court, got an injunction just prohibiting this farmer from violating the Michigan food and dairy laws. And what happened was they came back after the injunction was in place, found more of these products, and filed a court action filed a petition with the court to have this farmer held in contempt. The court, initially was hearing this testimony from the department's attorney that this guy was violating the grade A dairy laws. You can't do this and this. But the interesting part about it was that one of his leaseholders intervened as a party, because he was getting cream made and it was being taken every time in these raids or seizures. And because this guy was in there, all of a sudden, the focus of the court turned to, okay, well, let's not look at whether it's a violation of the grade A dairy law so much, but let's start concentrating more on whether it's a violation of the leaseholder's property rights. And so they had a hearing on this contempt of court action in October, and last month the judge ruled that the farmer was not in contempt of court. And the interesting thing about it was that the day the farmer found out about it, he was talking to his attorney, and while he was talking, he was getting raided again, because it was a semi-annual inspection date, and they cleaned out this refrigerator of all the butter and cream or whatever other products there were. Yeah, in this leaseholder room. As it turns out, the inspectors weren't aware of the court decision. Hopefully that'll be the end of it, but you never know.
Right. So when you say they cleaned out these value-added products, what kind of monetary amounts are we looking at here?
It depends. I mean, sometimes it can be in the hundreds of dollars, sometimes be over 1,000. I mean, there was... thankfully you don't get as many of these raids, but there was one about 10 years ago where they not only raided the farm where raw milk was kept, but they pulled the farmer's truck over on the highway, and I think they wound up taking like $7,000 worth of product. And it's just a total waste of good food. They usually wind up dumping it.
Not to mention the financial loss.
Right, the financial loss for these farmers who already are probably not...
broke.
Yeah, exactly. They're not meeting the poverty line many times. What I was going to say is, I remember the case of Mark Holt in Pennsylvania.
Right. Yeah, that's
or Nolt, sorry.
Mark Knoll.
Nolt is,
Right.
and yeah, and that was particularly. He's probably the most famous Amishman in the country now. But yeah, they handcuffed him in front of his kids. He had like what 10, 12 kids, and uh, I want to say what I was told at one point, and maybe this was a collective because they've gone in numerous times, that they've taken like well into five figures
Uh,
worth of
well,
dairy from this man.
yeah, I definitely think that's accurate. And they've, I think tried to fine him a bunch of money, and there still might be outstanding fines against him. I mean, I have no idea. He had so many different cases at one time. Trying to unravel them it's pretty complex. Yeah, it's difficult to just try and figure out everything he had going on with the state of Pennsylvania at one time. But bottom line is, I think they've left him alone for a number of years now, and wisely so. Hopefully, he's still feeding his community.
Right, and just for people who don't know, Land O'Lakes, the butter people, are huge in Pennsylvania. And you see their signs all over the dairies, the farms that sell them their milk. Throughout Pennsylvania, you see this, and I know that another farmer that I was purchasing from was dealing with the state as well. Had them, just searching his property constantly for what was there, and it's people think that the Amish maybe kind of get a pass for this because they do have very different ways of living. But no, not necessarily. I mean, most of these people don't go beyond fourth grade education, and they are being treated like common criminals. It reminds me of I always make these TV references, but Boardwalk Empire, and Prohibition and sale of alcohol.
Well, and that's a good comparison, Adrian. I mean, Prohibition is a dismal failure, and I think just this interstate raw milk ban is too. Just to me, the sign of a bad law is one that otherwise law-abiding citizens violate with regularity, and that's what you get with raw milk. I mean, just that law is so strict that I'd say technically there might be thousands of people each week in this country that violate it, most of them being consumers. Yeah, we actually filed a lawsuit challenging the interstate ban about half a dozen years ago. We got some very interesting things out of the lawsuit. When FDA responded to our complaint, just our complaint basically said the law was unconstitutional. Their views on just freedom of food choice became a matter of public record. And one of the things they said in the reply to our complaint was that there is no absolute right to consumer feed children any particular food. And then they also made a claim where they basically said that we don't have a fundamental right to our own physical and bodily health.
Wow.
So that woke a lot of people up, as to what the agency's views on of fundamental importance to all of us.
Right. Yeah. And I think most of us, whether or not we even believe in God, would think that that's kind of a God-given right to be healthy and eat food.
Very basic. But they're basically saying if that they want to give you a vaccination and you don't want to get the vaccination, that's too bad. I mean, it just, because this is more about just food here. It gets to the question of who has the right to determine what we put in our bodies. Is it us or is it the government? And FDA made their views pretty clear. But that was one thing. That, and it's out there now. It's on. I mean, people suspected that long before our case, but it's on the public record now, and I don't think they've changed their views at all. The last, that was one aspect of the case. And another aspect of the case was that the FDA just said, in again, the court documents, that they weren't going to enforce the law against individuals who cross state lines to pick up raw milk. I mean, if it's really that dangerous a product, why wouldn't you try and enforce it? And yeah, there are all kinds of individuals who go across state lines. There are all kinds of groups that go across state lines. But to me, it's just making a statement like that is at least somewhat of an admission about the weakness of the law. And then finally, the judge hearing the case ultimately dismissed the case. He said we didn't have standing. I mean, FDA really hadn't taken an enforcement action against any of our plaintiffs. One of our plaintiffs was subject to a state enforcement action, but when the judge dismissed the case, he said something to the effect that this law was in a state. The word he used was desuetude, and I'd never heard of that word before. But I think the basic meaning of it is not worth a flip, and he just pointed out that yeah, this really hadn't been enforced at all. I mean, since we've been in existence, we've seen it enforced once. So, I mean, why bother challenging it when FDA isn't enforcing it?
Right.
So, still, though, I mean, we do continue to challenge it. It's just there's always the threat of some kind of enforcement, but it's just a bad law in a number of respects. I mean, one of the unusual things about the law was that Congress had no involvement in this ban becoming law. I mean, it was based on there was a court decision where the judge ordered FDA to issue a regulation banning raw milk in interstate commerce. FDA issued the regulation. There was no input from Congress at all. A sidelight to that is we currently have a petition with FDA to lift the interstate ban on raw butter, and we're a co-petitioner along with Organic Pastures Dairy out of California, which is the largest raw milk dairy in the country. And one of the things we discovered in doing the research on this was the FDA has power to just issue what is called standards of identity for different foods. Like with milk, the FDA standard of identity is it has to be pasteurized, it has to be at least 3.25% milk fat, and so on. But there are exceptions to FDA having this power to issue standard of identity regulations, and one of them is butter. Just the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act specifically says that FDA cannot issue a standard of identity for butter. And actually, Congress has, through a definition where they basically say it can be raw or it can be pasteurized. So in issuing this blanket interstate ban on all dairy products, FDA is, to me, is basically violated or contravened this congressional statute on raw butter being able to be either pasteurized or unpasteurized.
Interesting.
Well, I mean butter, excuse me.
Right, and we know that that the soft cheeses, particularly the ones coming from Europe, those aren't allowed to be raw. We used to be able to get raw milk brie and camembert and things like that.
Yeah, well, that brings up another interesting aspect of this, Adrian, is that there's a federal regulation that says raw cheese has to be aged at least 60 days before it can be sold. And with a cheese like camembert, my understanding is that in France, its shelf life expires at the 57th day. After the 57th day, so yeah, technically you can't even sell it in this country. But again, it's another ban. I mean, different cheeses have different aging requirements, so it's just this blanket 60-day aging requirement just seems like it was a political solution to something, dispute over what should be and what shouldn't be pasteurized among cheeses, and it just, from a scientific standpoint, doesn't make any sense.
Right, and I'm glad that you said scientific standpoint, because people who do not understand food, who are not in the sciences, will say, well, the science says, but the science doesn't say that. Especially, and you can't trust, that's the other thing, you can't trust science when it comes from the people who stand to gain from it. So in other words,
right.
Science can be faked. They can just slap whatever conclusion they want on something and say it's science, and 75% of the population is going to swallow that.
Yeah, especially when it's funded by the corporations.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it's heavily politicized. I mean, to give you an example of that, there have been these, I guess, peer review studies where these conventional dairies have had samples taken out of their bulk tanks, and could be 1,000 cow, 5,000 cow dairies, and just these peer reviewers said there was a pretty high positive pathogen rate out of the samples taken, and that was produced for pasteurization that they tested. It wasn't milk that was produced for direct human consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And the dairy industry refuses to make a distinction between the two, but we have records of a number of different states that do require pathogen testing, and the rate for positive pathogen testing with raw milk that's produced for direct consumption is far lower than the rate was with raw milk produced for pasteurization. So it's just another example of the science getting politicized. I mean, the peer-reviewed journals are on part of this raw dairy ban for the most part. So it would probably be tough to publish the data, at least in this point. I mean, there's some signs things could be softening up a bit, but.
Right. I always say that peer-reviewed journals just mean that the conclusion agrees with whoever's advertising facing the study that's being reported on.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, at one time, I guess the tobacco companies were heavy advertisers in the Journal of the American Medical Association. So,
absolutely.
Yeah, you know how that goes.
Right. Exactly. So, it's just to let everybody out there know, it's not, don't just think, oh, it's a study. And the other thing too is that a lot of times particularly when you're looking online, they don't make the entire study available, for example, on PubMed without a subscription. And many times I've seen when I've had my medical journals and reading through the actual studies, what the studies report and the design of the study is often in complete opposition to the summary of said study. In other words, their summary does not always, their conclusion and their summary does not always reflect the actual data that's in the study. And I found that as well when I went to school for nutrition. We used standard dietetics books, which would say, they would talk about the vitamins or the vitamins in a particular food or minerals in a particular food or fat content or what the structure of a sugar molecule looks like, and then at the end they would summarize it by telling you, well, we said this, but there's these new fake fats that are on, like, remember Olestra? There's these new fake fats that are on the market, and these are much better for you. Right. They under a microscope, they look like olive oil or what have you. But you should just eat this instead. So, I'm very familiar, I'm painfully aware of the fact that the data is out there, but it's not necessarily the take-home message given to the consumer or to the doctor, for that matter.
Yeah, well, just as the saying goes, you have to follow the money.
For sure,
and,
for sure.
The dairy industry definitely has a stake in just limiting access to raw milk, and I think in a lot of ways the pharmaceutical industry does too.
Oh, for sure.
It might be a little more indirect, but I'm sure you've had someone from the Weston Price Foundation on.
I've had Sally herself.
Before. Well, there you go. Well, they have gone to a number of their conferences, and you just talk to people. Some of them have discredit raw milk for a cure when they might have had Crohn's disease or something like that. They credit raw milk of being part of the reason they were cured. But more often than not, what you see or what you get when you talk to people there is that they, a lot of them don't go to the doctors.
Yeah.
But even more than that, they don't take medication.
Yes.
Yeah, in that respect, I mean, I definitely think raw milk is a threat to the pharmaceutical industry, which is about the most powerful lobby there is right now.
Absolutely. It was totally handed over in the 80s and then continued in the 90s. So, yeah, I extremely aware of how insidious that industry is. That's the end of this week's episode of the podcast. Tune in next week when we find out what makes muffins so dangerous to the U.S. government, more secrets about food freedoms, and Peter's role working with the FTC-LDF. All coming up next week.
Nutrition Heretic Podcast is a production of Savor the Journey, LLC. Our audio editor is Nikola Popovich. Our podcast manager is Crystal McLean. And our operations manager is Michelle Med. I'm your host, Adrian Hugh, the Nutrition Heretic. You can find us at the new and improved nutritionheretic.com, where you can download the Nutrition Heretic's free shit list of 7 health foods to avoid like the plague. You can also listen to previous episodes at nutritionheretic.com/podcast. Be sure to like us on social media for updates. Our Facebook page is facebook.com/nutritionheretic and on Twitter @NutriHeretic. Contact us with show ideas, questions, or if you want to be a guest. And don't forget to rate our podcast on iTunes and Stitcher.